Hi, in this video I'm going to talk about the final project for the remote sensing class taught by Dr. Mitchell at University of Maryland. In this class, we were tasked with first understanding the fundamentals of remote sensing and its applications in the world, and then designing, building, and deploying a field-tested LiDAR system to map 3D targets on campus on an extremely low budget. In this video, I'll go over the setup construction, various fundamentals of remote sensing, as well as all the data processing and final point cloud manipulation and mesh generation that I did for the project. Hi, so this is my target. It's one of these outdoor tables outside of the Cambridge Community Center. As you can see, I have my LiDAR set up here, connected to my laptop running VNC viewer so I can see the script running. So the tables are sort of interesting. They have a bunch of slots in them, so the laser, more than half the beam passes right through. Also, even in the middle of the night, there are lights around, so it's sort of bright and reflective off the surface, which is in and of itself also shiny. So as you can see on the laptop screen, there's no red laser showing up, so the tracking hasn't exactly been working at all. But yeah, you can see, ideally it would be able to pick up just these parts and it would come out with a nice slotted pattern in the end. So things I can do to mitigate this are get a new laser that is more powerful, because these lights are stronger than anticipated and totally washing out the laser. So now that we have a target, we want to better understand the fundamentals of remote sensing to be able to best apply techniques for mapping it. Remote sensing is the acquisition of information about the environment without actually interacting with it, aka remotely sensing something. For this project, we must also just differentiate between active and passive remote sensing. Passive remote sensing is something as simple as taking a picture. You're not sending out any signals, you're just taking all the returns from just ambient environmental conditions. An active system, instead, has several more components and is slightly more complex, but can produce much better returns and much more controllable returns. In an active system, there's a transmitter, and there's a receiver, and there's obviously a target. What an active system does is it will send out a pulse or a signal from the transmitter, which will then bounce off of the target and return to the receiver. Depending on the type of LiDAR system, these are different types of signals. In a radar system, it's radio waves. In a sonar or SODAR system, it'd be sound waves. And in the LiDAR systems that we are using, it's light waves or lasers. In this system, we must also have several other components, such as a data acquisition system, which allows us to both send out the pulses and receive them, interacting with the laser light and the camera. And then we must also do data processing. In the end, to be able to actually understand these, turn them into points and 3D maps, not just images with recognized coordinates on them. For this class, we are using a LiDAR system that is essentially enabled through a computer vision system. So LiDAR is laser detection or light detection and ranging, and is essentially using light waves to do this remote sensing that we planned on doing. Computer vision is another very simple name, where it is just the practice of having computers interpret images and videos to be able to gain insights and data out of them. In this class, we're not using a timing-based LiDAR system, such as those that are common on autonomous vehicles, but instead we're using a geometrical LiDAR system. I'll discuss that more when I talk about the setup of the actual instrument. However, it's essentially based on separation distance between the transmitter and receiver, and some simple geometry which allows it to extremely simply and quickly determine ranges. When understanding LiDAR, it's important to also think about the difficulties that it will present. So we're using a laser light and my target is black and metal. So we won't get great returns because of the dark color and also the reflectivity. Other conditions such as ambient light that I mentioned in the other mentioned previously are also going to be factors. So understanding how to best improve returns, whether it's gaining actually more data per capture through long exposures, or improving returns by altering the target slightly in some way, could allow us to get much better data in the end. Hi. Now I'd like to talk about the actual setup of the LiDAR instrument itself. So I have it here. The overall goal of this was to be extremely low budget, and the total cost was under $130 for the entire system. This includes the mount that it was printed on, which was 3D printed, and securely holds both the laser and the camera, the Raspberry Pi, which runs the camera, provides power to the whole system, and runs also the data acquisition programs, as well as the Arduino and the IMU. The Arduino powers the laser and collects data from the IMU, transmits it back over serial back to the Raspberry Pi. All of this is powered by a very cheap USB battery bank on the back of about 3,000 milliamp hour capacity. So this LiDAR system isn't a timing-based LiDAR where pulses are sent out and the time-distance difference is measured, but instead it's a geometrical LiDAR. So as you can see, there's a separation distance of 12 inches between the laser and the camera, and due to that, you were able to find the distance with some simple trigonometry that I'll now explain. So as you can see on the mount, we have the receiver, the camera, and the transmitter, the laser. On your target, your laser light will come out and hit the target. This will mean that this spot will be bright red. From the camera image, you can take sort of the half plane, since it's always only going to be to one side, you can just take half the image and you can sort of count the pixels down to here and get a pixel count number down to where the laser light illuminates the target. And so, to find the hypotenuse of our big triangle, we just need to know this angle theta after knowing the number of pixels on this side and the separation distance here. So this angle theta was found by calibrating to find what's called the radians per pixel pitch, or RPC value, and the rho value, which is the radian offset value of our system. So radians per pixel pitch is sort of a function of the camera, and it's essentially how many degrees is each pixel. When we count down pixels, how many degrees are we counting? Because once you have that value, you can just multiply them through, and the number of pixels counted down times the degrees per pixel counted, and you can get this theta value extremely easily. You also must know the radian offset, which is the angle offset of the camera. So, as you can see here, once we know this RPC value, we can very easily find theta, and knowing D, we can find, or knowing H, we can find our separation distance to the target D, which allows us to actually 3D map. And then, when we shift our whole system down on the tripod, we have a new angle for the transmitter, which means it will hit a different point, and we'll be able to map different points of the target one by one. This technique applies not only for the line laser that we use, but for the point laser that was used in the previous semester's classes, as the technique is identical. The actual recognition of the laser point is done using OpenCV and applying an HSV mask, which basically filters the image based on its colors and can filter out the red light very consistently to where, and then apply a mask so that it appears to the computer as just a white line, and which can then distinguish the number of pixels much more easily between the actual return and the center plane, making for reliable, accurate ranging on an extremely low budget. So here you can see me performing calibration on the instrument. This is actually the second calibration that was done. The first calibration, which there is no video of, is of the leveling of the laser relative to the camera mount. And as you can see here, it's almost perfectly horizontally level, perpendicular to the actual angle of the mount, which means my laser points will be nice and continuous. Here I am measuring the distance between the door, which is my target, and the mount itself to be able to then type into a program, a lasercalibration.py, which allows me to calculate the RPC and rho values, which will then calibrate my setup to range at any distance within the operational range. This is done by taking data at a variety of ranges in order to properly calibrate the instrument. After calibrating and building the instrument, now we finally got to put it to use. Here I'm collecting data from my table, and you can see the instrument is mounted on my tripod and connected to my laptop, running the data generation code on the Raspberry Pi. I'm slowly changing the angle to build a full 3D point cloud of the target, and will collect data from all four sides. which have great access, one of the reasons I picked this target. Initially, I wasn't really getting any good returns off of the reflective black surface of the table with the standard setup. The first thing I did was to increase the exposure time of the Pi camera, which is actually, I don't think, a very common technique, but improved the returns by just simply collecting more light at each stage. Another was to alter the surface properties of the target by sprinkling either powdered sugar or putting a sheet on the target. This greatly improved my returns, and you can see how much the laser light reflects back more with the powdered sugar instead of just the reflective black surface. All of these helped me to build much better data and make my point cloud much better in the long run. Data processing was a key part of this project and required actually more work than the data collection itself. In this video, you can see me going through and applying the HSV mask and setting them to be able to best recognize the images and the laser light on the images. As you can see, I run the colorpicker.py script, which allows me to adjust H, S, and V sliders to filter the image on the right, and you can see how the threshold image, which would be masked, changes and better returns the laser light at certain settings. This was extremely important, and simply changing the HSV masks for different images would allowed me to improve my returns by going back and customizing them more. After this HSV mask was created, the data generation.py script, which is in the background, was run with the HSV values that were recorded in this with the colorpicker.py script. Running the data generation.py script, it transformed simply the thresholded image into an actual map of 3D points, which was then imported into Cloud Compare, which you can see running in the background. Cloud Compare was used to construct my overall point cloud and adjust it, and finally create my mesh, which will be discussed next. Here you can see the actual running of the data generation.py script. It prints out the titles of the images as it goes through them. The angles are transmitted through the file names of the images, and here you can see the data generation.py script also generates a little 3D point cloud of its own, so you can verify that your results came in accurately. Here I'm moving into Cloud Compare, importing my test results, and this is the way I manipulate them by simply clicking and dragging them in Cloud Compare. You can sort of toggle on and off the axes of freedom where it's allowed to move and translate, which makes it extremely convenient to properly align your images and work with your point cloud. I found this software to be extremely beneficial and used it in the end over MATLAB. As MATLAB, you had to alter a matrix, which was done through numbers and was much less intuitive and took much longer. Here you can see the cleanliness of, or how clean the data collected from this batch was. This was collected with a sheet, whereas the rest of them were using powdered sugar or long exposure techniques. And the returns were much, much better off the sheet due to the extremely improved surface that reflected the laser light much better. So here I'm working in Cloud Compare. As you can see, I have the full point cloud there already imported and merged into a single point cloud. Now I'm going to go over how to create the mesh. So the first thing you need is a set of normals for your points, and you go to plugins and then calculate hue normals. And increasing the neighborhood size helped a lot because the data set's fairly sparse, so having more neighbors helped to better align the data and get the normals pointing in the right direction, which is actually crucial for the surface formation of the mesh in the end. As you can see, it takes a second to go through here and compute the normals, after which they don't appear on the point cloud itself as they do in Mesh Lab, but you go to +1 surface reconstruction afterwards to actually create the mesh itself, which is once again in plugins. No settings were changed here for the final one. I played around with changing some, but never actually got improved results. And quickly you can see the final mesh that is produced here. One of the main things that's missing is one of the benches due to extremely bad ambient light and glare on it, and a lack of data on another one of the benches. Another key thing is the actual middle post under the bench was never picked up because it was occluded by other light and difficult to obscure. In the mesh itself, you can see the slats of the bench in both the table and the seat, and on the bottom of the seat, that show up due to the laser light reflecting through and getting some interesting returns on that. So that sort of speaks to the precision of the LiDAR. However, overall the accuracy is not great, as I got, due to ambient light, many strange returns and repeating returns and reflected returns, as well as dim ones that required HSV settings that weren't conducive to overall consistent settings. Overall, you can definitely tell that it's a bench, and I'm fairly happy with the final mesh that turned out.